Over the past couple of weeks, I've gotten a lot of questions about how to take dark, flat, and bias frames with the ASIAir Pro, so that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. Before we get started though, I want to stress that this is intended to be a general overview of how to take these 3 calibration frames with the ASIAir Pro. As you'll learn if you do your own research, things will change slightly depending on the software you're using, if you have a CMOS or CCD sensor, if your sensor is color or monochrome, and a whole lot more. You can even have 2 of the exact same camera models side by side, and they might not perform exactly the same. And that leads us into a whole rabbit hole that I'm not going to deal with, where this entire concept is so technical, you can spend hours, if not days, really trying to comprehend the finer points of bias frames, or dark frames, or flats, or anything else. So I'm not going to get into the weeds with all that technical detail, because I'm trying to keep it simple, give you something to start off with, and then for those of you who really want to go above and beyond, you can continue to do your own research. First, let's start out with bias frames because these are by far the easiest to do and they should only take you about a minute. So if you have your ASIAir Pro ready to go, you can follow along. And generally, I recommend taking these after your imaging session at the end of the night. Like I said, they only take about a minute to do. First, make sure that the gain matches what you used for your light frames. In my case, a gain of 200. This is really the most important thing, simply, is that the gain matches between your bias frames and your light frames. Everything else isn't as important. Once you've made sure that the gain is correct, it's really all you have to do. And again, if you're taking these immediately after your light frames at the end of the night, everything should already be set up and ready to go. Next, we can go to the Autorun feature here, and then we'll click the 3 little dots and lines, and that'll get us into the Autorun menu. Now, if you have anything here, you can clear it out, reset the progress, do whatever you have to do, and then we're going to create a new sequence right here. First up, we have our exposure, or our shutter speed. This needs to be as fast as possible, so you can either do the preset here of 0.01, or if you click that box with a slash through it, you can enter a manual value. And I want to go even faster, so I put 0.001, and there we go. For our filter, it really doesn't matter because we're going to be blocking off the camera sensor anyway in the telescope, so no light's going to be coming through. Therefore, you could have any filter on there, it doesn't make a difference. For the amount of photos, we need to take, I would say 100. Usually the more photos you have here, the better. It's going to give you a cleaner result at the end of the day. So you don't have to take 100, you could take more than 100, but for me that's kind of a good round number and it tends to do a good job. Finally, make sure you click that bias button at the bottom of the screen. That way it's labeled properly, and then you can hit OK. Now we can click the little back arrow in the top left of the screen to get to our actual shooting menu. From there, all you really have to do is click the circular button over on the right, and it's going to go through and take, in this case, 100 bias frames. And I want to be clear here, when you're taking your bias frames, you want to make sure that no light reaches the camera's sensor. That's why I put the lens cap on the front of my telescope, that way no light could reach the camera. Now obviously I'm recording this video during the day. You don't want to take your bias frames in broad daylight. You're better off taking these at the end of your imaging session in the middle of the night, or, I mean, with a dedicated astro camera or DSLR even, you can take these at any time, your bias frames. They're not time sensitive. So as long as there's a dark room you can put the camera in, or just if you're doing these middle of the night, that's fine. But the big thing here, again, is that no light reaches the camera's sensor. And then in this case, the ASIAir Pro is going to go through, it's going to take the 100 photos, show you a little preview. You can see all that electronic noise being generated there. And once it's complete, we've now done our bias frames, and we can move on to taking dark frames next. Before we get into dark frames though, I want to do a quick recap and make sure we're all on the same page. So for our bias frames, you need to make sure that the gain, or your ISO if you're using a DSLR, is the same as your light frames. You also need to take a very fast exposure, the fastest possible. If you're on a DSLR, that'd be like 1/4000th or 1/8000th of a second. On our dedicated astro camera here, it's like 0.01 or 0.001. Then you want to take about 100 bias frames, making sure that no light reaches the camera's sensor. That's the most important thing. The final point I want to make about bias frames is that you can reuse these in the future as long as you're using the same gain with your light frames. In other words, I took my bias frames at a gain of 200. If I photograph the Andromeda Galaxy a month from now using a gain of 200, I can reuse these bias frames. I don't need to take a whole new set that night. So that's one of the nice things about bias frames, is that provided the gain stays the same, you can use them for months at a time without needing to take new ones. Next, let's talk about dark frames. And the great thing is, these are very similar to bias frames. You only have to change a few things and you're ready to go. So once you finish taking your bias frames, again, usually you want to take these at the end of the night. Now we can swap over to our dark frames. For that, we're still on Autorun, but I'm going to click the 3 dots with the 3 lines. That's going to get me back into the shooting schedule. From here, usually you need to click Reset Progress down the lower left. That way you can just edit your original shooting schedule. So there we go, I cleared out the progress. Now I'm going to click on my shooting schedule where it says bias there. And now we need to enter our settings for the dark frame. This time I'm going to start at the bottom and work our way up. So you want to specify dark. That way the naming structure makes sense when you get to the computer. For the amount of photos, I usually recommend taking 20 dark frames. You can take more, but you're going to be wasting a lot of time if you do that. If you take any less, it might actually cause some artifacts in your photos. The filter doesn't matter, because just like our bias frames, no light is going to reach the sensor. Therefore, it doesn't matter what filter is in front of the camera. Finally, the exposure needs to be the exact same as your light frames. So if you took a 2-minute long photo or 120 seconds of Andromeda, you need to make sure that the exposure here is also 120 seconds. Now, as I mentioned, these dark frames take quite a while to complete. If you look at the bottom of the screen, it says estimated time 40 minutes and 2 seconds. So this is a big time investment, but one of the great things is that since we're using a dedicated Astro camera with a cooling system and the ASIAir Pro, you could theoretically take your dark frames whenever you want. It doesn't have to be immediately after your light frames. So if you go to your main camera settings here in the ASIAir Pro, you want to make sure that the gain is still the same as it was when you took your light frames. Also, verify that the cooling system is turned on and that your target temperature is also the same as it was when you took your light frames. If you do those 2 things correctly, then you can begin your auto run, take your dark frames, and like I said, it'll take quite a while to complete, but once that's done, you can incorporate those into your stacking process on the computer. All right, let's do a quick recap of our dark frames and then we'll move on to flats. So for our dark frames, you need to make sure that the gain, the exposure or the shutter speed, and the sensor temperature matches your light frames. If any one of those 3 things is not the same as your light frames, these are not going to work as well as they should. You also want to take about 20 dark frames for the best results. That's kind of like the sweet spot between wasting time and not having enough dark frames. And most importantly, you got to make sure that no light reaches the camera's sensor. If it does, it's going to really screw things up. That's why we usually recommend taking these in the middle of the night with no bright light shining on the camera or the lens. If you want to take these during the day, since we now have that ability with the cooling system, just make sure you put it in a dark room and no light is able to reach the camera at all. Finally, we have flat frames, and I've saved these for last because on the ASIAir Pro, they're surprisingly difficult to take. Before we get into that though, let's talk about how to take your flat frames. Number 1, you need to make sure that the gain is the same between your light frames and your flat frames. Number 2, if you use multiple filters throughout the night, you need to make sure that you take a set of flat frames for each filter. Number 3, the focus needs to stay the same between your light frames and your flat frames. So if you were to take the camera inside and the next morning you try and take your flats, you need to make sure that you put the focus back to where it was the night before. And if you have to change the focus ring quite a bit between your LRGB filters and your narrowband, you should factor that in as well. Also, if you're using a telephoto lens, you need to make sure you're at the exact same focal length. The main reason we're so adamant about the focal length and the focus staying the same is because that can throw off how large the dust appears, and also it will change the vignette, especially if you have a telephoto lens and you're zooming in and out. So verify that the focus and the focal length are the same before you start taking your flat frames. Finally, number 4, you need to make sure you're photographing an evenly lit light source. If you mess this one up, and it's easy to do, you're really going to be setting yourself up for a lot of problems once you get into the stacking. And if you do your own research online, you'll find a lot of different options for photographing an evenly lit light source. Personally, I want something simple, easy, and free, so I decided to photograph my TV screen. Unfortunately, when I did that, I had banding in my flat frames because my camera was picking up the refresh rate of the TV. Even if I put a t-shirt over the front of my telescope and did this, I was still picking up the banding. I don't know if that was just because the TV was so bright it was penetrating through the shirt or what, but then I tried photographing my laptop screen with the t-shirt rubber banded over the front, and this time I didn't have any more banding. So for me personally, I'm going to use my laptop screen from now on. Now that you understand the basics of taking your flat frames, let's talk about how to do all this inside the ASIAir Pro app. With the app started up, you can enter all your normal information, hit enter, and then we're going to be in our main workspace here. However, for a lot of you, you might be in the Autorun menu because you're taking your light, dark, or bias frames. Today though, for our flat frames, we want to start off in the preview menu right here. Don't forget, the gain needs to be the same for the flat frames as it was for your light frames. If you go to the main camera settings, you can see the gain right here. And for those of you who use different filters throughout the night with different gains, don't forget you have to come in here and change the gain for every filter if that's what you did for your light frames last night. For me, I used a gain of 200 the whole night regardless of the filter, so I'm good there. Finally, we want to go to the filter wheel settings and pick out the first filter we're going to create for our flat frames. If you're doing narrowband, then you might want to start off with sulfur, oxygen, or hydrogen alpha. If you're doing LRGB imaging, then might as well start off with L. Either way, get a filter that you used last night, and then we can get started. Provided you're pointed up at your evenly lit light source, you've got your gain dialed in, and your filter is selected, we can now start here in the preview menu. First, click on the exposure button in the lower right. We need to find our shutter speed or the exposure that's going to give us a flat, neutral gray image. However, this is where it's really tricky on the ASIAir Pro because we have to just keep clicking different exposures until we find the correct one. Thankfully, we have a histogram here in the app that's really going to help us out. So if you click the histogram button, it will bring it up at the bottom of the screen, but it's really not very intuitive. So let's explain what's going on here. In the very lower right, you should see information with max, min, and average, and then there's some values next to that, 65,000 in this case. What that corresponds to is that 65,000 is pure white. Oddly enough though, you're seeing a black image there in the background. So I don't know why the ASIAir app is showing you a black photo when it should be pure white, but it is. That's why you shouldn't rely on the picture, you should rely on the numbers. And again, 65,000 is pure white. What we're trying to do is get a flat gray image. Therefore, the values in this case should be around 32,000. And if you look towards the bottom center of the screen, you'll see 32,767. That's kind of our center point here in the app. If you can get that spike to center up with that value, you'll be in good shape. If you look over on the right, you'll notice my exposure is set to 0.01 seconds. So with that shutter speed, a gain of 200, my L filter, photographing my TV screen, if you look very closely, you'd see the average number here on the histogram is about 25,000. That's right about where we want to be for our values. That way we're getting a flat gray image that's not too bright or not too dark for our flat frames. Your challenge is going to be adjusting that exposure to get similar values. If the values are too high or too low, your flat frames are not going to work out properly. And that's exactly what we see here. I switched the exposure down to just 0.001 seconds, and now my new average value is only 3,000. The spike has also moved almost all the way to 0. It's no longer near the center at 32,767. So in this case, I would have to increase the exposure or the shutter speed to capture more light, increase the average value, and move that spike on the histogram towards the center of the screen. That's really what we're trying to do here, is pick different exposure values until you meet all those requirements. At this point, I'm sure some of you are saying, okay, if it's that much of a pain, just use another application for the flats. And that's what I thought of too. So I loaded up SharpCap, and then there's a really nice slider here for your exposure. Rather than screwing around clicking those buttons manually, you can just move the slider left and right very quickly, look down at the histogram in the lower right, and once you get it near the center, you're done. Then you can start taking your flats. That would be a much faster and easier way to do things. Unfortunately, there's a very important problem here, and that is the fact that the gain does not correspond with the ASIAir Pro app. Remember, I was using a gain of 200 in the app, and if we go back and look real quick, you can go from 0 to 300 in the ASIAir Pro app. However, here in SharpCap, the gain settings are completely different, and they don't correspond with what we see in the app. Therefore, it would be impossible for me to use SharpCap for my flat frames because I can never get the gain to match up properly with my light frames taken in the ASIAir Pro. All right, let's get back on track and finish taking these flat frames. So we're back in the ASIAir app. I've adjusted my exposure here until I find a value that's between 20 on the low end and about 35,000 on the high end. I'm mainly looking at the average value in the lower right. There it looks like it's about 26,000. That's good enough. Now I'm going to switch from my preview window to my Autorun. From here, I'll click the three dots and the three lines to get to my shooting schedule. Then I'm going to click on the shooting schedule button there. First, we need to adjust the exposure to what we figured out it was in the preview just a minute ago. Make sure you choose the correct filter as well. We're going to take 20 of these, and you want to make sure you specify these as flat frames. If you did all that, you can click the start button and begin taking your photos. In my case, though, what I'm doing is that I couldn't remember the number. Either it was 0.2, it was actually 0.02. So you're starting to see all these weird numbers starting to get confusing. You really got to make sure you remember what you're doing. Now that I've got it all dialed in, though, I'm going to click the center button over on the right to begin taking my photos. It's going to go through, take 20 images, and if you still have your histogram up, it will show you the correct values there. Our average is 26,000. That's really good. Once this completes with my 20 photos, then I can swap over to my R, G, or B filter if I'm doing LRGB imaging the night before. But for that, we want to go back to our preview and find the new exposure. Because remember, every time you change filters, the amount of light coming into the camera will change. So you have to figure out new values for every single filter, and this can be kind of a pain. Now that I've switched to my R filter, I'm going back to preview, and I'm going to take another test photo. My current exposure is 0.02 seconds, which is what it was for the L filter. However, the L filter lets in a lot more light than the R, so that's exactly what we see here. Now my average value is all the way down to 8,000. That's very low. It's not bright enough. So I need to click on my exposure button, use a longer shutter speed, maybe 0.2 or 0.05, something. Take another photo, look at the histogram, try and get it up around 30,000 roughly in this case. This case, it's about 19,000. That's not high enough. So I'm going to click on my exposure again, put it to maybe 0.1 seconds. Take another photo. You see how much of a pain this is? If you had sharp cap, you'd have already been done by now just by moving the slider. You wouldn't have to come in here and keep guessing back and forth. Now I'm at 39,000. That's okay, but it's a little bit high. But I'm just going to deal with it now. So I go back to my Autorun, click the three dots and the three lines. Then I have to reset my progress before it'll let me continue. So I click the reset progress button, click on my button there, switch to the R filter, make sure we're on flats. And I think my exposure was, what was it? I can't remember. That's the problem. I keep losing my train of thought here. So I put it to 0.2 seconds. I wasn't quite sure if that was right, so I went back to preview. In fact, it was 0.1. Now that I remember the correct value, I can go back to my Autorun, click the three dots and the three lines. And what I'm doing here is that rather than choosing one of the presets, which might not give you the proper exposure, you can click the box with a slash through it and enter your own. So let's say you're going between like 0.5 and 1 and neither's working, you can just put in 0.6 manually and get things exactly where you need to be. It's really important you know how to do that. Then you can click OK, click the back button in the upper left, and take your set of photos now for the R filter. And once it starts taking them and transmitting, you'll be able to make sure when the average value updates in the lower right that things are correct. And in this case, they were at 65,000, so I knew they were wrong. So I stopped it, went back into the Autorun, had to reset the progress, and then enter a value that was actually correct. And I keep getting my decimal places mixed up, so I had to do 0.06, not 0.6. This is why I hate using the ASIAir app for this flat frames. It's way too complicated than what it should be. This should take you 5 minutes to do. It shouldn't take you half an hour. And with all the troubleshooting here, I spent a whole afternoon once. I really didn't know what I was doing. And even now, I'm just barely starting to get the hang of it. So I've showed you the process very vaguely. Like I said, this is so much of a hassle that it was very hard for me to thoroughly explain it clearly to you because it's so convoluted to begin with. And I'm sure I lost a few of you along the way. So let's do one more recap using a green filter, and then we'll call it a day because I've had enough flat frames. I don't know about you. So I'm going to go to my green filter now, and we need to adjust our exposure to get a properly exposed image. Again, around 30,000 roughly in this case. So I'm going to start off just taking maybe a 0.05 exposure again, because between R and G, you really shouldn't lose that much light. And I'll take my shot right here. Once it finally loads up, it'll give us our new average value. If it's anywhere from 20 to 35,000, I'm happy. Let's see what it is. 21,000. That's okay. And I know I can always adjust my exposure a little bit using that feature I showed you a minute ago in the Autorun. So now that we verified we're at about 21,000 for the average at 0.05, I'll go back to Autorun. I want to get that average value up a little bit, so I'll reset my progress here in Autorun. Click on the box, change it to green, and I'm going to manually enter a value here of, let's see what I do, 0.08. That'll give me a little bit more light, and that should overall do a better job. So now I can take my photo. If I notice that the average value isn't correct during the Autorun, I'll just stop it, go back, and try something different. And in this case, let's see what happens. And it looks like it's going to stay at 21,852 because I guess I just got lazy and said, forget it, it's close enough. Ideally, it would have been closer to 30,000, just to let you know. But once I got that done, then I swapped to my B filter, repeated the process until that was done as well. If you're going to be doing narrowband flat frames, those will let in a lot less light. So you have to factor that in. If you're only doing like 0.05 for your exposure, with narrowband, your exposure might be as much as 1.5 seconds, if not 2 seconds. That's how much light they're going to cut out. All right, I'm done. I've had enough of this. I'm sure you're probably equally as worn out from this video. The whole point originally was to show you how to photograph your dark, flat, and bias frames with the ASIAir Pro and a dedicated Astro camera. As we learned, it's very easy to take your bias frames. It shouldn't take you more than a minute. Your dark frames are equally as easy to take, but those will be a lot longer. Anywhere from 40 minutes to 2 hours you'll spend taking your dark frames. Your flat frames, on the other hand, are a huge hassle, especially here in the app. It's way more complicated than it needs to be. So I want to make sure you at least have some idea of what's going on here before we go. The way I take my flat frames on the ASIAir Pro is I pick my filter, make sure the gain matches the light frames from the night before, then I go to the preview window. Next, I click on exposure and take a photo with my histogram active. Once the photo completes, I look down at my histogram, and more importantly, the average number in the lower right. I want it to be around 30,000. Right now, with my hydrogen alpha filter and a half-second exposure, it's at 9,547. That's way too dark, which is crazy because that's a half-second exposure pointed at a bright laptop screen. So I change it to 1 second. That should theoretically double the average value from 9,000 to about 19,000. Let's take a look. Yeah, 18,393. So once you can do some basic math and you start to understand what's going on, it should make things easier. If I know I'm at 18,000 now, if I do 2 seconds, that should put me up around 36,000 for my average value, which is a little high. Let's see what it gives us. Yep, we're at 36,000. At least now the math is starting to work out. Now, once I have that value in mind, I can get out of the preview and go to the Autorun menu. Once I'm in the Autorun menu, I can go back to the settings, reset the progress, and then change the filter from B to hydrogen alpha. Then, for my exposure time, I know that 2 seconds was too high. 1 second wasn't high enough. So I can click the box with the slash through it and enter a manual value of maybe 1.5, cut it right in half, and then I'll hit OK. Then I could click the back arrow and begin taking my photos, in this case my flats for the hydrogen alpha filter. Once the first image completes and it loads up, I double check the average value there in the lower right, make sure it's around 30,000, in this case 27,594, good enough. I'll let it run for all 20 photos, and I repeat that process. And it looks like there's an oddly heavy vignette up in that corner with that filter. That leads me to the final problem with flat frames, is that if you're photographing a light source that isn't evenly illuminated, you might be getting these false vignettes that when you include it in your stack, it actually causes your final image to turn out way worse. That's why I personally don't bother with flat frames, because my final images look great. And more likely than not, I'm going to screw it up or rip my hair out with this really complicated process that shouldn't be this difficult. And for me, the little value I'm going to get out of it is not worth the hassle. If you're using some type of other astrophotography software, like we saw SharpCap to take your photos, you could take your flat frames much more easily. And there's plenty of other laptop applications that will work just fine. But today, we're using the ASIAir in our smartphone, so it does come with some drawbacks. One final thing I want to caution you on is that if you're like me and you're starting to think about using another piece of software to handle your dark, flat, and bias frames, that might not work. As we saw with SharpCap, the gain settings in there are completely different from what they are here in the ASIAir Pro app. In other words, whatever software you use to take your light frames, use that to take your calibration frames as well. And if you're going to be using the ASIAir Pro to take your light frames, then you'd want to make sure you take your bias, dark, and flats in there. That way there's no discrepancies. As I was going back and editing this video, I realized there's one final point I want to make about flat frames, and that's the fact that these are also used to remove dust spots from your final image. And that brings up another unique problem, because if you wait too long between your light frames and your flat frames, it's possible that the dust in your photos will change as well. And when the dust spots don't line up properly between your light frames and your flat frames, you will get problems in the stacking software. That's just one more hassle with the flat frames, and that's personally why I don't bother taking them, because I don't really even notice any dust in my photos. The vignette is negligible too. So why would I spend all this time and frustration taking them? And also, if I screw one thing up, I'm actually going to cause more problems in the final stack, because maybe it's trying to remove dust that's not actually there, or it's trying to remove a vignette that isn't actually there because I didn't take my flat frames perfectly. That's just something you want to keep in the back of your mind. And always remember, take new flat frames pretty often. That way the dust spots line up between your flats and your lights for every single filter as well.